Happy Leif Erikson Day, and today's alternate history is what if the Vikings colonized America? We all know the Vikings reached America around 1000 AD, but in the long term, they really didn't make a massive long-term change to medieval and modern history. And the question of this alternate history is, what if they did? What if they were able to form long-term colonies? How would history be different? What would the borders be? That is the question of this alternate history. The main reason the Vinland colonies failed in our timeline was that Iceland and Greenland just simply didn't have enough people to supply major colonies and to do a major colonization effort. For the Vinland colony to work, the crowns of Europe and Scandinavia would have to become interested in the Americas to send settlers and troops to keep the colonies alive. And most likely, the Kingdom of the Isles and Norway would be the ones to fund trips to the Americas, because they were the ones with the largest cultural connection to Iceland and Greenland. With European interests involved, the Norse would have been able to maintain strongholds and settlements on the coast without it being driven off by the Beothuk and other Native American tribes. Over time, the coastal strongholds would get enough population to push the Native Americans back and move inland with their superior technology. Over time, the rest of Europe would start hearing about a land to the west that was extremely fertile, and Europe would be quite excited by the prospect of this. To see why, we need to look at the internal politics of 11th century Europe. The Viking and the Magyar Wars just dwindled down, meaning that there were a lot of soldiers left over from these wars. This, coupled with a population explosion, meant that there are way too many landless, well-armed sons of nobles, and they were just waiting for a war for them to prove their greatness and get a landed title, meaning there was a lot of infighting within Europe. This was one of the reasons for the Crusades. The Pope wanted to send all of these landless sons who were killing each other off to the Holy Land to fight the Muslims and push back the borders of Christianity instead of tearing Europe apart. Imagine you're an 11th century knight. You can either choose a land where the land is extremely fertile and the natives don't even know how to ride horses or use iron weapons, or you can choose another land where it's extremely desert-like and the natives have a similar technological level to your own. It's not much of a decision. There'd be a large non-Viking movement from Europe to the Americas in the 12th and 13th centuries, in place of the Crusades, and they'd mainly settle south of the Vikings, in the mid-Atlantic and south. It would be similar to the Teutonic Knights movement in the Middle Ages, where Germans and Scandinavians moved into the Baltic states and Eastern Europe to get their own land, but this was at the expense of the Slavic peoples, and it led to many wars between the native Slavs and the Germans. There's no easy way to describe it. Quickly, though. But without gunpowder and smallpox, the Europeans wouldn't have been able to conquer all of the Americas, and instead I think they would have been stopped at the Appalachians by the 13th century, and a front would have stabilized on the Appalachians. Meanwhile, with all the attention going to the Americas, the Crusades would have remained a minor mercenary trip to save Byzantium from the Turks. Without the disastrous Fourth Crusade, the Byzantines never would have lost Constantinople, and so they would have been able to survive as a Balkan power. Without the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, the Turks never would have entered Europe and would have remained a purely Middle Eastern dynasty, like the Safavids or the Sassanids. All of the wealth returning from the Americas would have to stop in either the Kingdom of the Isles, in Scotland, or in Norway, making both of these areas extremely wealthy. An often forgotten part of history is that, until the late 13th century, Scotland was basically just a collection of clans and duchies that loosely pledged allegiance to the king in Edinburgh, which was basically just the most powerful noble. The Norse Kingdom of the Isles would have gotten all the trade coming in from the Americas, meaning they would have been much more powerful in this timeline, meaning the Kingdom of the Isles would have been the duchy that would have united all of Scotland instead of the Edinburgh duchy. And so Scotland would have been a more Norse country in this timeline. Norwegians, with their newfounded wealth, would have invaded England, because medieval Norway did that quite a bit. And think about it this way. Norway, being a fairly poor nation, was able to almost conquer England multiple times. But imagine what they could have done with wealth. So I can assume that the Norwegians would have been able to conquer England. In this timeline, England would be a more Scandinavian-facing country, like it was in Anglo-Saxon times, and English would sound much more like German than it would like French. There would be a large split in Europe in this timeline. Southern Europe, in areas like France, Spain, and Italy, would be more Mediterranean-based, and they'd get a lot of their culture from Greek and Arabic culture. While meanwhile, Northern Europe would be more Atlantic and Scandinavian based, and they'd get a lot of cultural influence from the Americas, and in this area, the Germans, Russians, and English would lie. For example, in this timeline, Winchester Cathedral would look very different, as it would have more American and Scandinavian influences. It would look a lot more like Chichen Itza and the Ernst Stave Church in Norway. Germany having blood ties and trade ties to England and Scandinavia would mean that they would have been part of the Germanic north-facing sphere. As Germany would have been in the North Sea cultural sphere, they never would have gotten in the destructive war with the Papal States that indirectly led to the fall of the Hohenstaufen line and the collapse of a united Germany. And so, in this timeline, the Holy Roman Empire would have stayed united. I honestly cannot say how a united Holy Roman Empire would have changed European history. European history would have been utterly different. Germany, for hundreds of years, was a battleground between different European states, but having Germany be the country that projected armies outward would have totally changed the political balance of Europe, and I honestly can't explain how that would have worked out. But later on, I might figure it out, and in that case, I'll post a link in the description. Meanwhile, back in the Americas, in the 13th century, smallpox would hit the Native American populations and cause massive fatality rates amongst Native Americans, and this would lead to a European movement west, and the Europeans would move into the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley. But they wouldn't move much further than that, because by this point, the Native Americans likely would have learned European technology, and there wouldn't be a massive technology disparity. The Aztecs, Mayans, and Incas would have survived as civilizations until the present, because the Europeans were only able to conquer them in our timeline barely, and they had gunpowder. And since the Europeans wouldn't have had gunpowder, the Aztecs, Mayans, and Incans would have survived. The tribes in the eastern part of the Americas, closest to the Europeans, would get European technology first, meaning they'd conquer the tribes west of them who had not yet achieved European technology, and then they'd conquer the tribes west of them as they tried to escape west to get new lands, and so forth. As the tribes of the Great Plains would get the horse, they would become nomadic tribes like the Mongols or the Huns in Eurasia, and they'd attack the areas of the forest region and of Mexico around them, and create giant Mongol-like or Hunnic-like hordes, and be a general menace to the surrounding regions. In the 17th century, pike and shot-style formations destroyed the nomad tactics, meaning the nomads were practically defenseless against their farming neighbors. And so worldwide in the 17th century, there was a move of the farmers to conquer the plains. And this would happen in the Americas, where the forest tribes and the Aztecs would do a scramble to control the Great Plains, and there'd be a large amount of conflict between different nations for control over the Great Plains. Being cut off from the rest of North America by deserts and mountains, the west coast of North America was extremely lightly settled until very recently. And so, the Russians or the Japanese would have likely colonized the western part of the United States and Canada in the 18th or 19th centuries. South America would have been colonized by the Inca spreading out from the Andes, as well as European powers like the Portuguese or the Spanish. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment or subscribe. If you like this video, please stay tuned for my next video, which is What if the Phoenicians discovered America? And if you want to hear me talk more about pre-Columbian exploration, comment that in the box and I'll make a video about it.